Wrapped in a threadbare shawl, the widowed schoolteacher stood shivering in the sheriff's office as he leaned in and sneered, "Marry me, or freeze." Outside, the snow fell silent as judgment. Inside, her breath caught, not from the cold, but from the cruelty. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind that screamed down from the mountains that November was not just cold. It was punishing. It pushed through the cracks in Margaret Allen's cabin like fingers searching for warmth to steal. The chinking between the logs had thinned over the years, and though Robert had once patched it every fall with care and straw, now the gaps gaped wide like open wounds. The firewood pile outside, once a comfort, had dwindled to a sad pyramid of barkless limbs and damp splinters. Inside, Margaret wrapped herself in her husband's old wool coat, sleeves too long, shoulders too broad, and sat by the stove, watching the embers collapse inward with a sigh that felt all too human. Outside, Darrow's Pass moved on without her. The church bells still rang on Sundays. The butcher still raised his cleaver each morning. But Margaret had become a shadow on the edge of town life. Respected once, remembered faintly now. Children she had taught to read barely looked her way anymore, and their mothers avoided her on Main Street, not out of cruelty but discomfort. Everyone knew about the sheriff's offer, and everyone knew she had refused it. Her refusal had cost her. Each night, as the frost crept like mold up the corners of the window panes, Margaret would boil the same 3 potatoes, rotating them so they softened evenly in the shallow pot. Her hands, red with cold, no longer held a pen but a cracked ladle. The books on her shelf, David Copperfield, The Mill on the Floss, her beloved Longfellow, sat unopened. Her eyes, once sharp as quills, were dulled by hunger and loneliness. Still, she did not return to the sheriff. Not because she didn't feel fear. She did. It clawed at her in the dark hours when the wind moaned through the eaves like the ghost of a woman left to die. But pride lived in Margaret like a buried coal, faint, nearly smothered, but not yet dead. She thought often of Robert, how he used to say, "You carry your spine like a banner, Maggie." She carried it still, though her back ached and her knees stung with every step. And so, when the fire died completely one night and she felt the true silence of a cabin without heat, Margaret didn't cry. She simply pulled the coat tighter, folded her hands in her lap and whispered, "Let them talk." The days that followed Margaret's rejection of the sheriff's offer bled together like one long, unlit evening. Snow thickened on the roads, curling over fences like white ivy. Smoke from neighboring chimneys twisted upward into the gray, wind-lashed sky, a cruel reminder that others could afford the comfort she was denied. Each morning she awoke with the kind of chill that settled in the bones. Not just cold, but a coldness with memory, with consequence. And yet her spine stayed straight. Margaret had been a teacher for 36 years. She had taught sons of blacksmiths, daughters of seamstresses, boys with fists and girls with fire. She had stood firm through measles outbreaks and bad winters, and once, she had spoken on the church steps during a town hall when the mayor refused to fix the school roof. Back then, her voice had not trembled. Now she found herself bartering what little she had left, not pride, but possessions. She brought her late husband's Bible, worn and gold-edged, to the Reverend's wife, asking if it might be accepted in trade for a basket of wood. The woman took the book, held it in both hands with solemn respect, then said, "We'll pray for you, Miss Allen," and closed the door before Margaret could finish her sentence. Later, she approached the Dawson family. She had taught all 3 of their boys, helped the youngest with his stammer. But their mother, red-faced and hurried at the wash basin, could only murmur, "Times are hard," and turned away, wringing out a cloth with more focus than warmth. The walk to the mine was an act of desperation. She wrapped strips of cloth around her shoes and trudged through drifts that reached her knees, legs burning with each step. When she arrived, she was met not with cruelty but indifference. A shrug from a foreman, a glance from a laborer, and then silence as the men returned to their work. By the time she returned home, dusk was already falling. The world looked blue, as if bruised. Her fingers were stiff, her lips split and bleeding. Inside the cabin, she fed the last of the kindling into the stove and watched it catch with a whisper. A final gasp of light in a room sinking into dark. And then came the knock. Low, hesitant. Not the pounding of demand, but the tentative reach of memory. When she opened the door and saw the man, older, bearded, eyes lined by years and cold, she did not speak. Not at first. But when he said, "You told me I mattered," it was as if something in her, some forgotten corner of her own worth, stirred. Samuel Blake had come with coal, yes, but what he placed gently beside the hearth was heavier than fuel. It was recognition. And for the first time in a long, bitter season, she felt seen. By late December, the cabin on Hemlock Lane no longer looked abandoned. A wisp of steady smoke curled from the chimney each morning. The frost still clawed at the windows, but it was met with warmth from within. Not just from fire, but from something gentler, more enduring. Margaret Allen, once the forgotten widow of Darrow's Pass, had begun to stitch herself back into the fabric of the town, thread by thread, breath by breath. She hadn't spoken aloud of what passed between her and Sheriff Harrow. She didn't need to. Her refusal had said enough, and her quiet perseverance said the rest. Samuel Blake's visits had not sparked gossip so much as curiosity, then, slowly, respect. He always arrived just after noon on Fridays, boots dusted with snow, arms full of small offerings, parsnips, lard, needles threaded through scraps of calico. And every time, Margaret welcomed him not with longing or flattery, but with a chair beside the hearth and a pot already simmering. Their rhythm became familiar. He would carve wood, she would stitch. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It breathed. When they did speak, it was often about the past. Students she'd taught, horses he'd raised, the way the sky used to look before the mines came. There was laughter, too. Quiet, crinkling laughter that made her cheeks bloom like they hadn't in years. People noticed. Children came to her door with letters their parents couldn't read. Mothers brought dresses to mend. One man asked if she might look at his son's shaky penmanship. Even Pastor Finch arrived one morning with a Bible tucked under his arm and said, "I'd be grateful if you could lead the children through Psalms next Sunday. They listen better to you than to me." Margaret's eyes stung, but she only nodded and said, "If they'll sit still for it, I'll do my best." Her parlor became a sanctuary. Each Wednesday, children filed in, chapped hands clutching slates, ears red from the wind. They sat cross-legged on a braided rug as Margaret read aloud from the Velveteen Rabbit, Pilgrim's Progress, and her own notes written in a practiced, looping hand. Her voice was soft, deliberate, not performed, but offered. The fire crackled behind her, casting gold against the walls. Samuel sat in the corner, never interrupting. That day, he worked a piece of cedar in his hands, slowly shaving it into shape. When one girl asked who the initials M.A. were for, he only smiled and said, "Someone whose story isn't finished yet." Margaret heard, but said nothing. She just turned the page. The spring that arrived in Darrow's Pass that year felt different. Not simply warmer, but cleaner, as if the snow hadn't just melted, but swept something bitter away with it. The wind no longer howled through town like a warning. It carried the smell of thawed earth, laundry on lines and fresh bread cooling on window ledges. And with it came the sound of gossip, but not cruel this time. Curious, almost reverent. About the wedding no one had dared to predict, and yet everyone now claimed they'd seen coming all along. Margaret's cabin had been scrubbed and swept until the wood glowed. She'd done it herself, on her knees, humming low as she worked. The lilac tree in the back, the one Robert had planted but never seen bloom, stood in full flower, branches heavy with clusters of lavender blossoms that perfumed the air like memory softened by time. Beneath its shade, 2 chairs had been set up, facing rows of mismatched benches borrowed from the church, the schoolhouse, and a few generous neighbors. Margaret stood tall, wrapped in a shawl of her own making, a tapestry of cloth squares from old school uniforms, worn hems transformed into something beautiful. One patch had faint ink stains from a boy who never quite capped his pen. Another still smelled faintly of soap and mint. She wore no veil, no lace, no pearls. Only the quiet certainty of a woman who had lost dignity once and stitched it back with her own 2 hands. Samuel waited beneath the tree, his shirt pressed, his beard combed, and the same ink-stained cuffs at his wrists, cleaned but not erased. They were part of his story, and he wore them without apology. When he reached for Margaret's hand, he did not tremble. His palm was rough from work but steady as an oath. The preacher's words were simple, but Margaret's were not. When she turned to speak, her voice caught for a breath, not from fear, but the weight of the moment. I thought love was something you got once, if you were lucky, if you were young. But I was wrong. Love doesn't come when you expect it. Sometimes it waits, until the frost is past and the soil is ready again. And then it grows, quietly, steadily, like spring. Children clapped before the adults did. It broke the tension like sunlight through clouds. The townsfolk cheered, hats waved in the air, and someone passed around a tin of sweet rolls. No one spoke of the sheriff, or the cold, or the shame. Not anymore. Smoke rose from Margaret's chimney that afternoon, not in desperation, but in celebration. And when she looked across the lawn at Samuel, the boy she once told he mattered, she saw not just a partner, but proof that the soul, like the earth, could thaw and bloom.